Hello, and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown, and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Peter. Today on Dig It, we chat with Trevor Pfeiffer, who is the editor of Garden Trade magazine, and together with their website, publishes Garden Trade News. Trevor has his finger on the pulse of hundreds of garden centres, large and small, as well as the UK nursery growers. And we're so pleased that he's able to join us today. Hello, Trevor. Where do we find you today?
I'm in the office today, Chris.
Oh.
Yeah, just in the office, catching up on analysis of garden centre sales.
Okie dokie. Can we put a finger where exactly your offices are?
Oh, sorry. My offices are just to the east of Peterborough.
Oh, right. Okay.
Near a village called Thorney.
Okay.
My office is actually it's actually at home. It's in the garden at home, as it were.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, that's very handy. Great stuff, yeah.
I have a long journey to work every day.
I was going to say, it must be a really difficult commute some mornings,
It's shocking.
That's great. So Trevor, I mean, obviously we've sort of bumped into each other, visiting trade shows, and obviously you've popped over to the garden centre at Buckingham here. But my first question really we'd really like to know is how you got into journalism, into gardening journalism.
Well, I've been involved in magazines and newspapers since I left school, really.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only in the last 35 years that I've been involved in gardening magazines, and only the last 15 years that I've actually been doing any gardening journalism.
Oh, right.
Because when I first started out in magazines, I sold advertising space.
Okay.
And in those days, you were told if you sold advertising space, you could never be a journalist.
Really? Oh. Well, they got that wrong, didn't they?
Well, exactly. So I was been involved in the business side of gardening magazines. I published the garden magazine for the RHS. I published Garden News. You might remember a magazine called Practical Gardening.
I do.
That was a big seller in the past. And a magazine called Garden Answers.
Oh, yes.
And one of the first magazines I got involved in running the business side of was Garden Trade News, actually.
Okay.
But it was only when I left my publisher and set up my own business that we eventually managed to acquire Garden Trade News, which was about 15 to 18 years ago. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I started doing some journalism. Because when you run a small business on your own, you kind of have to do a bit of everything.
Yeah, definitely multitasking. Just going back to, I'm just fascinating. Obviously, Practical Gardening. Now that magazine, when I was growing up, was the go-to monthly magazine, wasn't it? And that was it Jeff Hamilton was heavily involved in that.
Jeff Hamilton was involved. That's before my time. The editor, when I first got involved in, was a gentleman by the name of Mike Wyatt.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Who was editing it. I think he took over from Jeff. But that was the market leading gardening magazine.
It was great.
Yes. But then along came the BBC with BBC Gardener's World magazine, and everything changed.
It did. Yes, as so many things do when it comes to the BBC.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. And so, obviously, you're working on a magazine which is online and in print. So, can you sort of paint a picture of your typical working day, Trevor?
I don't have a typical working day. I have a typical working week kind of thing.
Okay.
Because on days like today, where I'm doing analysis of garden centre sales, I was very much in the office analysing data and pulling together what we'll talk about probably later on in the bestsellers charts. But then other days I'll be out on the road visiting garden centres and visiting businesses that supply to garden centres, interviewing people, compiling stories, taking photographs, maybe for 1 or 2 days a week, and then the rest of the week is spent writing that up.
Of course.
Because, writing that up and then creating the magazine and creating the email newsletter that we send out.
Yes. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, publishing and well, journalism as well has moved on so much over the last few years, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Now one person can go and take photographs, record an interview, write it up. I actually do have other people that help me with the writing up, because if I tried to do it all myself, we'd never get the magazine published. It's quite interesting with our email newsletter that we publish every week, but we also do it more often if something happens that we need to report on. When we started doing that, which was probably about 15 years ago as well, everybody told me that we couldn't do it because there wasn't enough news to report on in the garden industry.
Really?
For us to have a magazine that published every week, and that's not the case.
No,
there's
definitely
plenty going on in the industry.
Yeah, and do you think it's the immediacy, isn't it, of what you can bring to your audience, isn't it? A printed magazine has obviously a lead-in time of probably nearly at least 4 or 5 days, isn't it, from being the final sort of proofreading to being printed to being sent out, whereas obviously an e-letter effectively you can do within just a matter of hours.
We can. If something breaks, if there's a big story that we need to get out, we can get that out within minutes, actually, out to people. And I'd say that the internet has changed the way we publish, in particular, in the sense that we now do the things we do in print we wouldn't do on the internet. So we try to use the print for longer interviews. And compiling a number of things together for our readers, whereas the internet is just short, sharp stories that people want to dip in and dip out of. Yeah. It's really quite interesting. It's helped, actually. I think it's helped us get clarity on what material is right for the magazine versus what we use the internet for.
I can see exactly where you're going, and I think and I suppose we're all as consumers, as users of the World Wide Web, we're all in that sort of mind frame that we get these nuggets of news, don't we now, which we can analyse, and if we need to find out more, there's plenty of good resources out there to do that. That's true. I mean, do you think that has widened your audience to your magazine through the internet?
Yes, I think we do get a wider audience, in particular because people can just find it without us having to email the content to them. And there are times when our readership numbers really peak if there's a story gone out there that has wider interest. So without a doubt, it has widened the scope and the readership of Garden Trade News. But you must remember, we're not looking for a huge audience, particularly. We're just looking for the right people, the people who are involved in garden centre retailing and their suppliers, to be reading it, because that's our target market. So
and I think reading both the printed and the online, that helps me so much, even when we're talking to our customers on the day-to-day basis, because we've got a bit of a handle on what's happening out there. Whether it's the peak debate or sustainability, or obviously recent news which we've had to obviously break over the last obviously few weeks with the death of the Queen, where you want to know what other garden centres were doing and how it was all handled. So I think for that reason, it certainly helps the retailer's point of view with their customers. Talking about sort of stories, can I ask Trevor, what is, in your journalistic capacity at the magazine, what's the sort of biggest ever breaking story have you brought?
I guess the biggest ever breaking news story we broke was when all the Wyvale garden centres were being sold off.
Oh, okay.
That gave Garden Trade News the biggest consistently high opening rate and readership as people followed that story. And quite often we were lucky that we were able to break the news that a certain group of batch of garden centres had been sold off before other people, before other magazines did. So that probably has to go down as our biggest ever breaking news story. Sadly, the next, probably most recent biggest ever breaking news story was the sad death of Peter Seabrook,
Of course.
Which took us all by huge surprise. But yeah, that was a big breaking news story when we learned that and had to put that news out there. So.
Yes, indeed, and obviously Peter was a major figure in the horticultural trade, as we know from his podcast, which was very well subscribed to obviously his wonderful writings in lots of the gardening trade journals, and obviously in the consumer magazine world as well.
Yeah. No, he was a huge advocate for gardening and the garden industry, huge supporter of everything that we did, and he. It's quite interesting because although he worked for a competitor magazine to Garden Trade News, he was always helpful.
Yeah.
He always helped me. If ever I needed any advice, I could always pick up the phone and have a chat with Peter, and he'd be more than happy to help me. So
yeah,
he was a wonderful person. Very
much so, yes. Sadly missed by us all. And I think his legacy continues, though, doesn't it? Because I know, and I've seen some news reports of obviously the David Colgrave Foundation that's had an endorsement now, isn't it? From I think it's Alan Titchmarsh is now sort of mustered in as the patron or the main person.
That's right.
And we're getting a lovely new sweet pea variety this autumn being released as well. And I think we're even getting a rose next year. With Peter's name attached, so he lives on. He will live on in our gardens as well as in our hearts, I'm sure.
He certainly will do.
Trevor, one thing I was going to say is you've obviously you're talking about Peter Seabrook. You must have obviously interviewed some really big names in the gardening world, in the consumer world. Who sort of stands out as one of your highlights?
Well, you see, I've not interviewed many gardening personalities in consumer world because most of the people I interview are people that run garden centres.
Okay.
Or so I mean a highlight I would say is Guy Topping from Barton Grange Garden Centre was a very interesting interview.
Okay.
Especially the way he's developed that garden centre, because it now not only has a garden, it's not only a very big and successful garden centre, it has a marina on the canal for long boats, narrow boats and things like that, but also has an entertainment complex on site called the Flower Bowl. It was very interesting interviewing him with how he saw the development of his business and his consumers, his customers.
Yeah. I was going to say that's really interesting because in my college days, I went to Mysco College up in Lancashire. Now we used to visit the original Barton Grange with the late and great Eddie Topping. That was obviously his dad, and we always, obviously as students, we sort of gleaned that this was a garden centre to look at and watch and observe because they were doing sort of so many things right. So. Yeah, the legacy obviously continues, doesn't it, in this new garden centre?
If any of your listeners and your customers are in that part of Lancashire on their way up to the Lake District, do stop off at Barton Grange, because you can go and look around a great garden centre, but also you can go to the cinema. Because they have a 4-screen, 3 or 4 screen cinema in the leisure complex.
That's fantastic.
And it's what interests me is that I have this thing about people that run garden centres well that come from a horticultural background have this innate sense of nurture, and because you have to have a good sense of nurture to sell plants, because you can't sell dead plants. Plants have got to be good, and where people apply that sense of nurture to other things that they do, they tend to do it better than other people do. And if you look around any really good plant centre, garden centre, you'll find that they serve good coffee, they sell great gifts, and at Barton Grange, the way they've set their leisure complex up is just the attention to detail is stunning. It really, really does make you feel like you've had a really great time when you've been there.
Yeah, and that's what it's all about now, isn't it? This term, I know we use it, destination garden centre. Well, if it ticks all the boxes, then surely it's doing its job, isn't it? And some more, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I think it's more than just it being a destination. It needs to be a memorable destination.
True.
If somebody goes to a garden centre and has a memorable experience, chances are they'll come back.
Yeah.
And that's what we need. We need people to come back more often, and we need people to tell other people that they've had a great experience.
Yeah. And I think that's probably more true now with obviously a lot of new gardeners coming on the scene. Obviously after the pandemic, I mean, I think HTA reckon 2 or 3 million new gardeners we've sort of developed over the last few years, and they need to have a sense of purpose that where they're going for their advice, their plants. They want a good time. They want to be entertained as well as perhaps educated too.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's interesting as well, because they do have slightly the new gardeners. All the research tells us they do have a slightly different outlook on life. So therefore, good garden centres, and I'm sure you're doing this at Buckingham, you just need to merchandise things and present things in a slightly different way to make sure that people understand and get it. So I think there's quite a bit of change to come in garden centre retailing, just to keep it very relevant to the new gardeners and make sure that they enjoy it and come back. And from what I gather, they are, and looking at sales figures, they are.
That's good.
But I just think we need to have an eye on that going forward.
Yeah, indeed. It's how it's presented, isn't it? And we assume when we're in the garden centre world that people know stuff, and actually it's sometimes breaking things down into the components and the ingredients, just like doing like watching Bake Off at the moment and watching how something's created. Gardening is much the same, isn't it? You've got to look at what you need to do to get the end result, and sometimes that means sort of stepping back, which can be, when you're in the thick of it, in the garden centre world, probably more difficult than perhaps we tend to think. I don't know. Trevor, when I was putting these questions together, I just wondered, what was the best part of your job working on GTN?
Well, I think the best part of my job is when I get to present awards to people. There's two lots of awards that we do. One is we do the new product awards at Glee, which is a Glee for your readers. So that's our major industry trade show. Okay. And we run the new product awards, and I get to present those on stage. So that's really good fun, and the suppliers that win are very happy. But probably even better than that is when we do our greatest awards, where we go out and garden centre teams are nominated in various categories, and we're just starting to work on our Christmas awards at the moment. So the winning garden centre Christmas teams, when they receive awards, they are so pleased. It's just wonderful. And I love that. I really love that part of the job.
It sounds good. Yes. So
and it's great. It's great actually, just going out and meeting the teams in the garden centres when they've been nominated, because just actually telling them they've been nominated and getting them together for a photograph and listening to what they do, it's just wonderful to hear all these great stories about great teams of people doing great things.
Yeah, I'm sure that must help everybody's morale as well. Especially when, as we know, it can be it is hard work putting a wonderful display together, and it takes a lot of preparation time. There's probably a lot of heartache going through how you're going to set up your displays and things, and to get some sort of recognition at the end of the day, that's what it's about, isn't it? And being part of a team helps that process. Oh, that sounds really good.
Yeah, and I think the teams that are most enthusiastic, well, Christmas display teams are really enthusiastic, but Christmas grotto teams are even more enthusiastic to win.
Right. Not competitive anyway, are they?
No, but they all do such a great job. I mean, if you want an example of how garden centres can take a sense of nurture and turn that into a really good grotto experience. There's a garden centre I know of near the borders of Scotland, who they have a very simple grotto. It's Santa just sitting in there, what's usually a garden shed. But everybody that books up to go and see Santa, the garden centre phones the parents a few days before their visit to Santa to find out what the little child has been doing.
Oh, I see.
And so Santa can can comment on whether the boy or girl has been playing football at the weekend or what they've been doing at school. No, maybe that bit should be cut out if this is going out on consumers, because we don't want children to know this.
No, of course no. But
It's just an example of how only a guy that cares about plants and cares about things that much will come up with an idea and go to the effort of doing that sort of thing.
I love the idea of parental intelligence. That sounds so good.
Yeah,
that's lovely. Okay, so my next question really is: do you have any sort of garden trade sort of heroes? I mean, we're talking about heroes from the world of journalism, but what about the heroes from trade? Obviously, you mentioned the wonderful Topping family. Anybody else sort of springs to mind?
Wow, garden trade heroes. Mike Burks.
Mm-hmm.
He probably wouldn't want me to think that he's a hero of mine, but he's a hero in the sense that they run garden centres down in Dorset, and they just have this real sense of team. It's the best sense of team I've ever seen at any garden centre business, to the extent where every morning at 10 o'clock and every afternoon at 4 o'clock, they all gather in the plant area to have a tea break. Oh. And this great big teapot of tea comes out, and all the mugs, and everybody at some point, obviously they have to do a bit of rota, but everybody gathers around the teapot outside in the plant area.
Wow.
To have a cup of tea. And so it enables them to do communication, enables them to do, motivation stuff. Just everybody gets to have a cup of tea out in the plant area, and I just think, what a great thing to do.
It is. That sounds really good.
They've been doing it for years, and I would say that makes him a hero to me, because he just clearly gets it and understands that actually his people are really, really important.
Yeah, and getting them together in a very probably more informal way once a week is a good way of, just getting...
Oh no, it's not once a week. No, it's twice a day.
Twice
every
a day.
Day.
Oh wow.
Even at weekends.
Goodness me.
It's tea break. Oh yes. If you're ever down that way, Chris, make sure you arrive around 10 o'clock or 4 o'clock so you can join in the staff tea break.
I'm on my way after recording this, Trevor. Definitely. Sounds great. Wow. Okay, that's amazing. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Obviously, these garden heroes obviously push the business in a very positive way. Obviously, we are in funny times at the moment. We've just come through a pandemic. I mean, do you see a lot of positivity from the gardening trade on what's sort of lying ahead for us?
Oh, well, that's really interesting, because we've just had the HTA conference where the theme of the conference was Horticulture 2030, and we had a few people paint some very pessimistic pictures of what things could be like in 2030.
Great.
Especially the economist. Okay. And Simon Reeve, the TV journalist, documentary, he said we need a dose of pessimism going forward, mainly to do with climate change. But it's really interesting, because actually everybody, this is my personal view, everybody who's involved in our industry actually tends to be quite optimistic, and it's because we grow plants, and if you plant a bulb, you plant it with the optimism that it's going to bloom into a daffodil or a tulip.
Indeed.
So I think the whole, if you're involved in gardening, you are by nature optimistic, because you're doing something constructive and something grows.
For sure.
So I think that so for as many people as there were lots of people at conference saying, yes, okay, but if it's a recession, people will still garden. We've been through recessions before, and gardening's done okay. And I would say that just from what I see in my bestsellers data, in terms of volume of products sold and gardening activity, it's still big. People are doing it, and those 3 million new gardeners aren't all going to give up on gardening.
Definitely.
It's kind of like if if you've started doing something in your garden, you're not all of a sudden going to leave it and so let it go to rack and ruin, are you? You're going to keep moving it on. And I actually think Christmas won't be as bad as some people are maybe painting it out to be.
No.
In garden centres. I think people will want a bit of cheer.
Indeed.
We might sell more battery powered Christmas lights this year rather than plug-in Christmas lights.
Yep.
But I think that people will go out and buy Christmas trees still because they'll want to decorate and give themselves some cheer through the middle of the winter.
For sure. No, I quite agree. I think I was sort of, certainly I remember obviously in the 1980s when we had sort of a bad time and I was in the garden centre world up in the northwest. I always contended that to enjoy gardening you don't have to spend a lot of money. And if you're saying if that's buying a bag of tulips or a packet of seeds, that's the thing. You continue to do what you do in the garden. All right, you might not buy a very expensive set of garden furniture, or you may delay buying a nice garden building, but perhaps for the day-to-day stuff, for your compost, for your fertilizers, you don't have to invest an awful lot of money to get a lot of return, a lot of interest and relaxation and fun from your garden.
No, and when it comes to visiting garden centres, provided garden centres continue to deliver to serve great coffee, great tea, and great food, then that will keep them busy. So I think garden centres have got so much going for them. Yes, it will be tougher next year and through this winter for certain.
Yes.
But it's not time to be packing up and going home.
No, definitely not.
No.
Definitely not, Trevor. Trevor, you chatted, you alluded to your garden trade news bestsellers. So, can you tell us a little bit about it? Obviously, we've got a lot of people listening to Dig It who are obviously keen gardeners. What sort of information does that sort of feed back to them indirectly?
Yeah, well, it's all indirect. So the idea is to have charts of what sells most in garden centres, a bit like the old record charts. And so we collate data from a number of garden centres every week, and produce bestsellers charts. And how that helps customers? Well, it helps customers because it keeps garden centres' finger on the pulse as to knowing what's selling most, so they can make sure they've got it stocked. And also it maybe helps customers in terms of there's a bit of a lead lag time on it. So we produce a plants chart every week where we list the most popular genus or group of plants that sold each week. And when we first started doing that, a direct result of that was one garden centre told me that as a result of that, they decided to start to bring in and start selling their poinsettias earlier, 2 weeks earlier in future, because they'd seen other people were selling them in our data. So that's good. And I'm not quite sure how it's going to affect, but this year, during this summer, we had 3 weeks, I think it was, where petunias outsold zonal geraniums.
Really?
Now that hasn't happened in all the time I've been doing the bestsellers analysis, and we're trying to get to the bottom of why. Somebody suggested it might be because people wanted the blue to go in red, white, and blue displays because of the Jubilee.
Of course.
But other people suggested it could just be because the number of varieties are so high. Petunias, that there's so much choice around at the moment, but just not quite, just don't quite know what that's all about. But it will be interesting to see whether it happens again next year.
For sure, whether it was just a blip because of seasonal or celebrationary times, maybe. Yes, that's the thing as well.
Yes,
yeah. Okay. So on going back to the products, then there's obviously plenty of new things coming onto the gardening trade, and I suppose over the years, Trevor, you've seen obviously lots of sort of standout innovation come and go. Perhaps, I don't know. From your observations, is there anything there sort of followed any sort of trends, or something which you could think might actually sort of sit popular there?
Well, I suppose actually a while back, garden lighting, several years back, we saw the rise of garden lighting sales, which tailed off actually in 2019 and through the pandemic. And it's only just this last summer that garden lighting has really started to sell again in big numbers.
Okay.
It's one of those products. I think it started selling in the early 2011, 2012, because it was coming in at a really good price point for people, and people were picking it up almost as a disposable item. And interestingly, during this summer, a number of lines went on sale at very good promotional prices. So it may well be that the garden lighting is very much a pick up and and buy line, and not worry about how long it's going to last. I don't know.
Yeah, and so maybe as well the sort of the technology on those sort of products as well is improving all the time as well, isn't it? You know, the extra luminance.
Yes, it is.
So that might be a reason people probably hold on to them until.
And it may well be that they didn't sell so well during this summer just because the weather was so good and people spent time outside, but they didn't need lights, and it wasn't until the night started drawing in. But that is not what we saw back in 2011, 2012, when it was being sold all year round in garden products. So, so one interesting thing is it's because we do a chart of veg to grow products, and that really has followed the growth in people planting seed potatoes to have a crop at Christmas.
Okay.
That is something that has grown over the years, over the last 10, 12 years.
That's interesting.
That's an interesting area.
Yeah, we certainly, Trevor, at the garden centre here, we sold out, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. Much earlier than normal, because sometimes we'd have a few packs left over, but no, through online, and obviously our garden centre customers coming in, and they've had good experiences. You know, anecdotally talking to customers, it's worked well for them. I think last year's mild winter would certainly have helped that factor as well. So that's good.
I was going to say, but back in when we started doing bestsellers, those autumn planting seed potatoes weren't available. So you know, it is a fairly recent thing that they've become widely available. As far as I'm aware. Adam Taylor may correct me on that.
I think going back when I was doing a little bit of research many years ago, I think the shall we say the more specialist seed companies, people like Marshall's, Unwin's, who were around at the time, they offered them through their catalogues, but they weren't sort of sold through the garden centre. And it's obviously Taylor's have looked at that market and seized it with good results, which is great.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of other things. When we first started doing our bestsellers charts, we were amazed to find that at that time the best-selling product was an orchid drip feeder.
Okay.
Because our analysis is done by volume, numbers of items sold rather than by value. And the orchid drip feeders, all of a sudden, nobody realised how important they were and how much they were selling. They don't sell so many now, and I'm not sure whether that's just because people are not pushing them as well, or whether customers have moved on from drip feeders to actually orchid feed, and they've just become more sophisticated.
I think I think you're quite right. I think that the sort of specialist orchid products out there from people like Grove Technology, niche orchid products have been put under the noses of customers, and of course, let's face it, the moth orchid now, Phalaenopsis is the best-selling flowering houseplant, isn't it, by far? And I suppose people want to get the best from those plants, so they're probably seeking out slightly more, niche products to ensure that their plants do well. But I think the poinsettia dripper as well. I think that's another one we tend to sort of sell quite a lot of. I think it's the phyto dripper, which always seems to sell well, and that's in the same sort of marketplace as I suppose as that orchid one you mentioned.
Well, the phyto orchid drip feeder was the first one that we highlighted as being a bestseller. And at the time, I remember people vehemently saying, "No, it's not." And I said, it is.
Excellent.
And eventually people realised because several people who said it wasn't started doing their own version of drip feeder because they realised there was big sales of it.
There we go. Yes. Reputation. Trevor, there's obviously many sort of major issues sort of facing gardeners and the gardening trade at the moment, from recycling to peat-based compost. The debates, continue. Is this a subject that, garden trade news takes particularly seriously?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's our job to communicate to the garden centres what's going on and what's upcoming in terms of sustainability issues and on the peat debate. On the peat debate, we had quite an interesting situation because we had a number of our readers saying, well, we just don't understand why is peat a problem. So we had to do some thorough analysis to explain to people why what the peat issue was, why it was needed to be taken seriously, and actually now that I think the government were always going to ban peat because the environmental lobbyists had won that debate. The issue now that the industry is going to have to solve, and indeed gardeners we're going to have to help gardeners with is there enough other material that's good enough to do the same job as peat?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if there is, how much is it going to cost, and will people still be happy to afford it?
Yes,
because without a doubt, growing media is going to go up in price.
And we've seen that already, haven't we? I mean, it's already since the pandemic. Composts of all persuasions have increased, quite dramatically. Yeah. We've got the multi-buys have sort of disappeared. But I suppose, the radical change, obviously, last December that people like Dobbies and I think it was B&Q and Homebase, they made a big decision to completely get rid of their peat-based products overnight, didn't they? I mean, it was quite. Yeah. I think that was quite a shock to a lot of gardeners, to say the least. And certainly, we got a lot of people at the garden centre here saying, are you going to be doing the same? Gosh, what are we going to do? Because we've never ventured into the world of a peat-free compost.
Yeah. But the whole thing's quite interesting, isn't it? Because if you go back to the 60s, the 50s and 60s, peat wasn't used as a growing media. Back along. Plants were grown in soil. And it was only when, and there are people who I've spoken to, Paul Cooling at Cooling's Nurseries remembers his father being involved in the trials of peat as a growing media.
Okay.
So we've been through this whole thing before. The trouble is we've probably not got enough time to trial enough other mediums to replace peat.
Indeed.
Properly. I personally think that the best way that the industry could solve people's problems is to stop selling multi-purpose compost and sell compost for that's manufactured for a specific purpose.
Yep.
Because if people are buying multi-purpose compost and digging it into their garden, into their allotment, or into their bed, that's just not good. They should be using a soil conditioner for that.
Indeed.
But I think increasingly the suppliers will be able to produce compost that does a particular job because they'll put certain additives into it to make it work. I'm thinking about, a compost that's going to go in a container needs to have a way of retaining water, because none of the existing peat-free alternatives retain water as well as peat.
Indeed.
But somebody's going to have to develop that.
Yep.
Because otherwise everybody's going to be using far too much water to keep their plants alive.
Yes, catch-22, isn't it, really? Yes.
Well, Westland have got close to it this year with their plant food that they launched called Boost, which has a water retention additive, so it makes the water and the feed sticky.
Yep.
That sticks to the roots, apparently. So you can almost sell that with every bag of peat-free compost. Yes. But the next development will be somebody will create a compost with that kind of technology built into it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But then, so but I really do think we ought to consider stop selling multi-purpose compost, because I don't think there will be a peat-free compost that you can use for every single use. You know, it's it just peat. You could do peat as a multi-purpose compost because you could use peat. Peat worked in almost every situation, but the new ones, I don't think will. Okay. I'm not horticulturalist, so I'm not eminently qualified to comment on that. But I kind of just know from what we use in our own garden.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely, Trevor, you're absolutely right. And certainly the feedback we get from our customers is the fact that they just don't get the product. They just don't understand it. It's quite alien to them. It doesn't react and it doesn't work as peat did. And the thing is, the manufacturers could make so much more information of that available, actually, even on the packaging, just to explain about the watering regimes, that you have to give it more water, for example. So there's lots of things the manufacturers could do literally overnight to make it. But I think I would go along with your rationale about multi-purpose. I think, yes, it's big. It was a product which came out of convenience, but actually now the convenience is the fact that we've got to find the right product to do the job, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, yes, and watering is going to be a big issue going forward, I think, as a result of that for people. So, but then there's an opportunity for watering products. There's two ways of looking at the peat thing. Either it's a terrible thing that's going to drive us all to stop gardening, or we look at it as an opportunity,
indeed,
to develop new products and develop new techniques so that people can enjoy their gardening all the more.
Yeah. And
I know which end I'm backing.
Yeah, indeed. And I think garden centres are already realising that the palette of plants we start to offer might have to change. We realise that, but you've got to get a sense of priority here. We've had obviously a couple of years of very dry weather. Who knows what this winter's going to bring? When you look at the Met Office figures, they always say after very hot summers, you usually get quite a cold winter. So, and it could be cold and wet, incredibly wet. So we have to be preparing for that. So really, global warming, do you think that's going to be a factor to put in the frame for the gardening trade?
Undoubtedly. I think we will start selling more plants that are, suitable for a warmer climate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it will have something to do. And I think the whole sustainability thing linked into that. I think people will go to a garden centre increasingly expecting it to be a sustainable business.
Indeed.
I think they will expect to go to a garden centre, and if they're driving an electric car, they'll want to be able to plug it in and charge it.
Indeed.
That's not necessarily an easy thing for every garden centre to do because they're in rural locations and maybe don't have the supply available. But that, I think if somebody gets some advice from somebody in a garden centre, they will expect that advice to be sustainable advice.
Of course.
Except it may well be, well, yes, but if you really want to get rid of weeds, you need to use this. But that's not the sustainable option. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly. Yes.
It's kind of, they will expect garden centres to have that answer and that knowledge. But nature's an amazing thing, isn't it? Because I can remember looking at our apples on our apple tree in the really hot summer, thinking we're not going to have any apples this year. It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, we've got a huge crop of the most wonderful tasting apples this year, and they're all they're growing to their normal size as well.
Indeed, nature is full of surprises.
Yeah. Well, the things that, and this is, we've just got to get things to planting. I suppose one thing that's interesting that we need to think about is an awful lot of people, especially during the pandemic, have gardened by planting plants in containers.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting thing, because if you've got plants in containers, can become very work intensive and labour intensive, and plants in containers is very much, can be a victim of the climate and of long hot summers. Whereas if you've got things planted in the ground, then they've got a chance to build up a huge, really good root system.
Yes.
And I guess I just know that because all of our hedges have put on enormous growth this year. But that's because they've got good root systems
and they search out moisture, don't they? At the end of the day, that's the thing. In a container, they're restricted. Yeah. Yeah. Trevor, the trade shows obviously are important for the gardening trade. Obviously, they introduce lots of new products which tempt all our customers at garden centres, and of course they're now returning after the break of the pandemic. How important do you think these trade shows are these days? I mean, are they as crucial with information being available online?
Oh, I think they're vitally important because they're a chance for a garden centre to go to a show, go to one place and see a whole range of products, compare like-for-like products versus a competitor, to actually pick it up, feel the product, see how it works. I think trade shows are vital. They may never be as big as they were in the past, but in a way, that's not such a bad thing because when you go to a trade show with 500 exhibitors, you can't go and see 500 exhibitors even in 2 or 3 days. You can't, it's impossible. So I don't see, if they're a bit small, I don't see that's a problem. But I think the initial thing about the pandemic is people thought, oh, yes, we can do Zoom meetings instead and we don't do the travelling. But then people realised, yes, but I do need to go to the showroom because I actually need to find out more about these products. Yeah. And they ended up doing miles and miles and miles visiting lots of different showrooms. And so actually a trade show in one place where all these people gather in one place,
of course, makes more
sense. Is a good idea.
Yeah.
Whether or not there's too many trade shows, that's another question.
Well, there you go. That's another day, perhaps. Yeah.
Another day, yeah.
Trevor, we do like to do a bit of crystal ball gazing. How do you see the world of the garden centre and garden centre retailing develop over, say, the next 10 years?
I think garden centres have taken over the position of the department store on the high street, and they're in such a good place because they have plenty of parking and people can get there and enjoy. And the other thing about garden centres is that in the main they're all different. You go from one garden centre to another garden centre and you might see some of the same products, but you will see it presented in a different way, and you haven't got the boring homogenous retailing that you've got on the high street. Yeah. So I think garden centres will be as resilient as everything, and part of that is because we sell plants and we sell plants well, and plants grow and plants die, and it's a seasonal business, and we're very good at it. Yeah. It's really interesting. Garden centres, I like in garden centres, because garden centres sell lots of plants, so they have lots of lines, lots of individual SKUs, as they're called, in stock lines. And they cope with that very, very well. And so therefore, when they do Christmas, they're also happy to have lots of SKUs. And when they do other things, they like to have lots of things, which gives people lots of choice. Whereas high street retailers don't like lots of product lines. They like to keep their product range small, and so they can manage it easier.
That's true.
And negotiate harder with suppliers. And if garden centres all start going down the high street route of managing their number of SKUs down, well, they won't do very well because they'll go the same way as all other retail. But I just don't see garden centres doing it because we can't do that with plants, can we? You can't have a restricted library of plants.
No.
Because you just won't sell any because you've got to have the choice for people, haven't you?
And that choice has been really tricky these last couple of years to keep momentum there because there hasn't been the plants around, which has been obviously a nightmare for a lot of our customers who've been fretting that we can't find things. Do you think that sort of progression over the next few years is going to involve more technology?
More technology. I think garden centres are learning how to use the internet as a way of letting people know what's available in store. And some of them have developed very good online sales operations with local deliveries, which seem to be working well. There seems to be a question mark over online garden centres full stop. because one went out of business just recently, I think. I do think garden centres are in a great place because people want to go and touch a plant, see a plant.
Yes.
You want to actually choose the best one from what you can buy, don't you?
We do.
That's part of the experience.
Most definitely.
So, I think technology. Technology is bound to play a part because it does in everything. But exactly, there's lots of apps now, aren't there, where you can find out more information about a plant.
Indeed. Yeah.
But I think the strong thing about a garden centre is you can go to a garden centre and you can ask a person about the plants and get an answer.
I think, location-wise, I mean, having the local knowledge as well certainly helps, especially a new gardener coming to an area, a new build garden or completely new to gardening as well. You could say, well, this is the list of plants which will do well in, Buckingham clay soil, and you can give people a list and they can go away with that knowledge, which as a garden centre like ourselves have built up over the last sort of 50 years. You get to know your soil, you get to know your plants, therefore you get to know your customers, I suppose.
And I bet you if we did some research into sources of garden information, I bet you sources of information from a garden centre would be one of the most trusted bits of retail information.
I would hope so.
Because if you ask somebody in a garden centre which weed killer is best for X problem, and they give you an answer and you go and buy it, well, you're just going to. I just don't think you're going to ignore it, are you? You're not going to ignore that advice, and the chances are it's going to be right.
Yeah. I hope so.
Very interesting. When I very first started working in gardening magazines, we did some research that proved the biggest influencer of gardening at the time, but must remember this was in the 80s, late 80s, was word of mouth over the garden fence.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that was quite interesting because it meant that experienced gardeners are the biggest fonts of all knowledge, and I suppose it's that they've been doing it longest.
Indeed. And I suppose now in like Facebook groups, you've got horticultural groups, specialist groups on palms and trees, and you can click in and join those groups and share such a wealth of information, and gain so much knowledge through that sort of word of mouth over the internet.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. I'm sure now word of mouth will probably not be the number one because people will probably use Google be the number one source of all information. But I still think that if you can go to a garden centre and ask somebody, that's just got to be the best advice in the world.
Most definitely, yeah. I would hope so. Trevor, you report and you promote horticulture through the GTN website, and of course you have your printed monthly magazine. But do you do a spot of gardening yourself?
Do I do a spot of gardening? Well, we have a rather large garden. I wouldn't say I do any gardening particularly, but I do what I have to do, what I'm asked to do in the garden. I'm not the head gardener.
Okay.
But do I have a favourite plant?
Yes, please.
Oh, blimey. Favourite plant? Wow, you've got me there, Chris.
Oh, okay.
My favourite plant at the moment is a squash.
Oh, okay. Well, there's nothing wrong with a squash.
Well, and when we grow two varieties of it, we grow a baked potato squash and a mashed potato squash.
Okay.
And I have to say, they are the most wonderful vegetables. If anybody gets a chance to grow them and eat them, they are just amazing.
They're good. Okay, well there you go. Yeah, put those on the good old shopping list. Okay. And do you have any favourite?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any favourite gardens at all? You get or maybe garden centres which have a wonderful outdoor space. I know a lot of garden centres have really nice sort of garden areas. Is there any one you can think to spring to mind?
Crikey. Well, my favourite garden centre is actually in the northwest coast of Scotland, and it's a little garden centre called Poppies.
Okay.
In near Oban.
Oh wow!
It's
okay.
My favourite my favourite garden centre because you sit in the coffee shop and you look out over the loch, out to mountains in the distance, and it's just amazing.
Wow.
Tranquil, peaceful, because the garden centre is right down by the loch side.
Mm-hmm.
So that I would say that's my favourite garden centre location. Yes.
Top of the country, and top spot as well.
Yes.
Fantastic. Trevor, we always like to put our expert guests on the spot, and if you were ever stranded on that desert island, which plant or garden tool would you like to be stranded with?
Oh, well, garden tool would be my trench. Is it called a trench digging spade?
Oh yes,
it's a very very long, narrow spade, because I use that constantly for putting fence posts in, for digging up plants. It's really long and it's really strong. So that would be my tool. Yeah. And which plant? Well, I think at the moment I'd be quite happy to be stuck with a potato squash because it'd keep me well fed.
It would, and probably grow really well on that. We always assume this desert island is quite tropical, so they'd grow really well there, wouldn't they, as well? Yeah.
They don't. Looking at the way they're growing out in our veg plot, I can just about see out of my office window. When they get growing, they do not get growing. I suppose we're lucky because we grow ours on a lot of manure, so we create almost like a hotbed.
Ah, right.
And if you create a hotbed of horse manure, boy, they do not go.
Perfect. Oh, there you go. That's a really good tip for our Dig It customers there. And Trevor, do you finally, as we're coming to the end of the interview now, do you have any amusing stories or jokes or anecdotes from your wonderful time working on GTN?
Well, I suppose an amusing story is that a while ago, Neil Grant from Ferndale Garden Centre inspired me to start wearing flowery shirts whenever I was doing anything on stage. Okay. And I now only wear flowery shirts.
Excellent.
And so shirts with bold flower patterns on. And, I wear them on the train if I'm going down to London or just anywhere, everywhere, wherever I am now. It's kind of become my uniform.
Yes.
And it's surprising how many people come up to you and say, I like this shirt. And they smile because you're wearing flowers.
Yes.
And that's just like the power of gardening and the power of flowers.
Perfect.
It's just wonderful, it cheers people up.
It certainly does, yeah. I used to always wear a sunflower tie when I worked on the gardening magazines. When I was out and about, that was my sort of trademark. Yeah. And ties have just gone out of fashion these days. Obviously, I can't at a garden centre here, although I'd love to. But you're right; they do add. It's your own personality in a way is put on show, and it's a really good way of, as you say, connecting yourself with what you that's your passion, isn't it?
Well, and we've extended it to the extent where on the last day of the trade show Glee, we run Floral Thursday for Green Fingers, and we encourage as many people as possible at the show to come along wearing floral attire. Perfect. And we get everybody together for a big photo opportunity, and we set a new world record this year. And we raised over £3,000 for the Green Fingers gardening charity as a result.
Oh, well done.
So not only can you cheer everybody up and have people walking around with smiles on their faces all day, you can raise money for a good cause as well. So
yeah, that's a great way of doing it, isn't it? And a few bob for a charity in a fun way, which is to be good. Trevor, it's been an absolute delight chatting to you today on Dig It. For me, it's been really interesting, and hopefully our Dig It listeners will get a bit of an insight on what goes behind the scenes on a busy weekly, monthly GTN.
Well, certainly, I hope the listeners do find it. If they want to see some of what they do, if they go to gardentradenews.co.uk, they'll find the current issue of the weekly email newsletter and links to find the magazine online.
Perfect. So you've done the plug for me already. That's lovely. Thank you, Trevor, and thank you for your time today.
All right, Chris. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.